In December 1865, Butler decides he's going to take a ship, fill it with explosives, sail it right up to the fort, and then it blows up, and then the fort blows up, and then they can all charge in. It didn't work. So in January, they decided they're going to do a complete infantry assault. Now, they do have a couple hundred sailors and Marines that land, but they don't really do so hot. So Ames is ultimately the man on the ground who's in charge of taking this last great Confederate fort. And he does. In fact, during the battle, one of his officers reports that Ames is in the midst of the fighting. And I think this is pretty interesting because at this point, Ames is about to be made a brevet major general in the United States Army Volunteers. He's with his men in the front, and according to reports, he's swinging a musket and loading and firing like an average private would. So he is not just behind the lines directing things, he's actually in the fray as someone who's about to be a brevet major general. If you ever want to read his account of Fort Fisher, you can read that for free online. He actually self-published a book in the 1890s defending himself because he felt like he got overlooked at this battle. Of course, everybody wanted to take credit for this battle because it's the last big Confederate fort to take. But with that, Ames is promoted to Major General. He's 28 years old at this time, and he's doing really well for himself. He decides to stay in the military because he is a colonel in the U.S. military by the end. So even though he gives up his volunteer commission, he's a colonel in the United States military. But he's been at war for so long and he's tired that he decides that he's actually going to explore Europe for a year. And so he goes to Europe from 1866 to 1867. Now, I mentioned the whole Forrest Gump thing where he sees everything. While he's there, he listens to a speech by Otto von Bismarck. He meets Napoleon III of France. He travels to Paris. He goes to Ireland. He meets the most famous artist circles that you can think of in London and Paris. He sees military parades. And what's fascinating is he goes to the Vatican, and you can kind of see he's very prejudicial against Catholicism when he goes there, of course, being an uptight New England Puritan type, right? Well, what's also fascinating during this time is Ames is reading newspapers and hearing reports about what's going on back in the country with Andrew Johnson and early Reconstruction. And when he comes back to the States after his leave, he comes back really interested in the political sphere for the first time. Not just the military, but he's getting interested in the actual politics of the country because he's very much concerned about what's going on. Ames is a by the book. If the Constitution says it, it's gospel. And so when he looks at these, what he calls insurrectionists, he's interested in enforcing the law. So he actually goes and becomes the military governor of Mississippi after the war. And while he's there, he starts to see the plight of the post-war South. Now, something happens that's kind of controversial. Mississippi decides to ratify a new constitution that has to acknowledge the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And Ames is the military governor, and he approves of it. Well, before you have an amendment change in the 20th century, you were not voting senators by popular vote. It was your legislature that actually picked your senators. And so the legislature picks two men to represent them as U.S. senators in Washington, and one of them is Ames. And so the controversy is Ames the governor has to say, I, as Ames the governor, approve of Ames the senator going to Washington. And people think that's kind of not ideal. But technically it was legal. But this is actually going to be a quote-unquote a scandal that follows him because some people said that he shouldn't have done that. Now, I mentioned that Butler was important. And one of the reasons why Butler is so important is because Ames is going to marry his daughter in 1870. When Ames is in Washington as a senator, he meets Blanche Butler. That's the only known illustration/image I know of her as a young lady. This is actually a picture of them getting married in Lowell, Massachusetts. So think about this. Benjamin Butler, a big political mover and shaker before the war, now in Congress after the war, very wealthy family. Ames now marries into that family. So now he's kind of getting some political prestige. But also, as we know, he's still the beast of New Orleans. Butler is. So Ames is marrying into a very controversial family, albeit a very wealthy family. So this family is going to both help and hurt Adelbert Ames while he's senator. When he's senator, he's very well known for advocating for the rights of former soldiers, but he also starts going after a new group that's starting to become increasingly strong in the region, and that's the Ku Klux Klan. And so he actually becomes integral in fighting against the Ku Klux Klan while he's in the U.S. Senate. But even though he's a senator, he decides, however, that his political growth might be most beneficial if he runs for governor. And so he decides that he's going to run for governor in 1873. He's only the senator for 3 years. He doesn't even finish out his entire term completely. So he decides to run for governor, but it's a very contentious election because at this time, it's going to be whoever the Republican nominee is going to win, okay? And a name you might recognize because if you've driven through Northeast Mississippi, there's a county called Alcorn. And it's named after James Lusk Alcorn. Now, James Lusk Alcorn is a lot less of a radical Republican than Ames is and Ames's allies are. Lusk is a lot more of a moderate when it comes to civil rights and so forth. And so Ames basically is saying, I will be the one that keeps preserving civil rights. I'm the one that will keep the Confederates at bay from retaking over the political sphere of Mississippi. And that's why Ames is going to win. In fact, Ames is still stump speeching. The very day of the election, he almost doesn't make it to vote. He arrives at the booth literally soaking wet with mud on his boots because he's barely able to get back to Natchez and vote. And ultimately, Ames wins. But in doing so, he makes a lot of big enemies. Because when Ames wins, the Republican vote gets completely divided. All the white Republicans, generally speaking, vote for Alcorn. All the black Republicans, generally speaking, vote for Ames. And so this is ultimately going to be a foreshadowing of how the Republican Party loses Mississippi because their vote gets split in two. And a lot of the scalawags won't vote for Ames, and most of the black Republicans won't vote for Alcorn. So Ames moves into the governor's mansion, but it's while he's governor that a lot of things that are rather turbulent happen, okay? So we've got Alcorn up there. We have some of the first black representatives in Congress, Republican members. Some of them are from Mississippi. You have the courthouse in Vicksburg. You have a guy named Lucius Lamar. We'll talk about him in a minute. And then, of course, you have a picture from the 1930s of the governor's mansion. Ames has a long, interesting history with the governor's mansion because when he's the military governor, the governor, quote unquote, that's put in there in 1868 refuses to leave. And Ames is like, leave or I'll send infantry and cavalry in to take you out. But now in 1873, when he goes into the governor's mansion, he doesn't have to force his way in. Although one of my favorite quotes of all time, and it's also a quote in the book, is not by Ames, but actually by his wife Blanche. His wife Blanche is from Massachusetts. She's from high society. She honestly hates living in Mississippi. She also has young children, and it's really hot, and she doesn't want to be down there. But when Blanche comes in as the first lady of Mississippi, she starts fighting with the staff. Because the staff are used to doing things differently than what she wants. And one of my favorite quotes is that she's trying to convince the cook that lard is not the staff of life. Because apparently there's way too much lard in the food, which I think is hilarious. Ames's wife is incredibly important because she offers a lot of confidence when Ames starts to waver a little bit. When Ames becomes governor, he has a lot of proposals for tax cuts, for a balanced budget. He wants to open up schooling for everyone. He wants to invite outside businesses like railroads to come in. In fact, after the Civil War, Mississippi has literally like one working locomotive. Like it's that small. There's buildings in important towns like Meridian that are completely damaged. I think I want to say that Meridian had like 5, it's in the book, but has like 5 buildings standing after the war. Like it's pretty destroyed. So Ames has all these really grandiose ideas, but as one of my mentors, Stephen Woodworth, who teaches at TCU, would say, if the people of the South didn't want to change, didn't matter how many policies you had coming in there. And also, by definition, Ames is a carpetbagger. A lot of people don't want to like him. Now, Richard Current would argue, and I think this is fair, that not all carpetbaggers are the same. Some come down to exploit, some just happen to be there. But Ames ultimately gets lopped in with all of those. But the big turning point happens during the Mississippi Troubles because on the federal level, you have people like Lucius Lamar who's starting to say that Ames in Mississippi, it's not being run very well. And then on a local level, you've got outright violence breaking out. You have riots taking place. In fact, in Vicksburg, you actually have almost a battle take place between local militia and then, well, local militia, but not legitimate local militia. If those of you that are familiar with the story of the Free State of Jones, you had the Matthew McConaughey movie that came out not that long ago. Newt Knight actually volunteers and works with Ames to help create a state militia. The problem is that Newt Knight is the only white man in that entire militia. So feeding into the fears of a racial war, Ames's militia are only black Republicans. There's not a single white man other than Newt Knight. So the whole thing's getting inflamed. In fact, Ames sends his family out of Mississippi, and he asks that his wife sends him his service revolver so he can have it with him at all times. And you might say, well, that's a little bit maybe paranoid, and maybe it's because he's having a depressed episode. True, but Lucius Lamar, who is a sitting congressman in D.C., is advocating that a mob goes to the governor's mansion and lynch Ames. So it's kind of intense, to say the least. And so not only are things getting really intense, but also in 1875, you have your statewide elections. Now, there's a concern that these elections aren't going to be legitimate. And Ames makes a blunder. He trusts that the opposition party and the Ku Klux Klan are going to behave. They make a deal. The deal is there will be no violence on Election Day. They honor that deal, but they said nothing about 48 hours before Election Day. Okay, they said nothing about 72 hours before Election Day. So the Republican base stays home and doesn't go to the polls. And the newspapers say, no violence on Election Day. It's because people have been so terrified the week before that no one shows up. Or what will happen is some of the opposition party will hire certain people, predominantly black Republicans. They'll give them an offer they can't refuse. They'll offer them a lot of money to go and vote for the Democratic Party. They'll give them money to do that. And the idea is, well, if this man did it, he's a reputable man in the community, they must not be so bad. So what ends up happening is Ames loses both chambers during that time. And he's very tempted to resign. But instead, during his gubernatorial annual speech that happens at the beginning of 1876, he basically gives them the proverbial middle finger during his speech and says that he's not going anywhere. He's going to try to enforce his policies. And the response is impeachment. Now, if you like legal jargon and you like reading ad nauseum interviews, you can actually go online and read the entire transcript of Ames's impeachment trial. He is one of only two governors during Reconstruction to go through impeachment, and he's the only one where you have an entire trial go all the way through. Ames has, now, we had an impeachment recently at the federal level, right? I want to say it was like 2 different separate charges against Donald Trump in 2020, I think it was. There were 2 separate ones. And people were saying, well, that's excessive to have 2. All you need is 1 potentially to impeach somebody. Ames has over 20. So they're not just trying to get Ames out. They want him out and tarnished. And you can read what the impeachment managers say. Basically what happens is they're charging him for misusing funds, taking advantage of the convict lease system, and also illegally making appointments. The problem is that all of those things are actually given to him by his constitutional powers. And it also helps that there's receipts that show he didn't actually spend the money that they say he did. Also, it doesn't hurt either that his father-in-law, Benjamin Butler, gives him like the A-plus crack defense team of any defense team. He has 3 lawyers defending him. They're from Philadelphia. They're from New York. And Ames and his defense team are able to shoot down all 20 plus of these articles. But there's 2 things that happen that ultimately hurt him because the public opinion is everything, right? His lieutenant governor and his secretary of education are immensely corrupt. They're examples of corrupt carpetbaggers, and they get impeached and jettisoned out of office. Well, the logic is that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, does it? So in the court of public opinion, Ames looks incredibly guilty. But also what they do is they throw in more impeachment articles because the 20 didn't work. So they're going to throw in some more. And they are really incendiary. You know how the story goes that it's not if you have to tell the truth, it's just be the first one to tell your story, right? Because the first story is the one that sometimes people believe. One of the impeachment charges is that Ames, because we talked about some corruption with the convict leasing system, that Ames looked the other way, there was bribery involved, and a child rapist got let out and not punished. This is Victorian America. For there to be a story about something like that is really, really even more insidious than at other times, right? Because it's the prim, proper, high collar, very modest. But they dropped that impeachment charge against Ames. Now, it's a ludicrous charge, but that's not what the newspapers print. And so in March of 1876, Ames is at his wit's end, but his wife comes up with a brilliant idea. She says, look, what if we strike a deal where they drop the charges, you resign, and then we go our separate ways? Because Ames is willing to fight to the end, but he's worried about his reputation. What ultimately happens, though, is that occurs as Blanche suggested. Ames says, I'll resign if you drop the charges. They drop the charges. He resigns. Kind of makes it clear the whole purpose was just to get him to resign. It wasn't actually to hold him accountable for any wrongdoings. So with that, Ames is gone. And he's actually going to go to Washington, D.C., and he's going to give these massive testimonies because Congress is going to look at what happened. Why did things go wrong in Mississippi? The reason why Ames in Mississippi is so important is that the White Leaguers and the Klan and the Redemptionists, they're called, that are wanting to reclaim the South, that are wanting to stop Reconstruction, they come up with something literally called the Mississippi Plan, which means you do what we did to Ames. We intimidate people at the ballot box, and we impeach them if we can't get rid of them. And so what happens to Ames ends up becoming kind of the blueprint for what happens for the rest of Reconstruction. So that's the end of Ames's public life. He never runs for public office again. He never returns to Mississippi. Wonder why. He never goes back to Mississippi ever again. But that doesn't mean his life ends. His life actually gets a lot more interesting because he is going to get in a gunfight with Jesse James. You didn't expect that twist, did you? So Ames's family are born and raised in New England, but his father actually during the Civil War is going to relocate his family to Minnesota, and he's going to get into the flour mill business. So Ames decides he's going to move to Minnesota too. His mother's there, his father's there, his brother is there, so he decides he's going to move there too. And it just so happens that on September 7th, 1876, Ames is at the flour mill, and he's looking over the books, and one of his employees races in, panting, and says, there's a robbery going down in town. So Ames drops what he's doing and races into town. Turns out that the James Younger gang, along with some of their associates, are in town. They arrived by train not that long ago. Everybody was, they should have been kind of suspicious because you had these guys with chaps and spurs and a lot of guns walking through town the day before they robbed the bank. And then, of course, the next day they robbed the bank. It's very much disputed, particularly people that are Jesse James apologists, as to who did what. Because during the course of this, 2 civilians are going to get murdered by the gang during the course of it. One of the killings is particularly grisly because when the robbers go inside, the one clerk jumps out the window and escapes, but the other clerk says he forgot the combination, won't open it, and they club him to death, cracking open his skull. And so the James gang's really mad because they can't get the money. And while that happens, Ames and the rest of the town are literally surrounding them, and everybody's got a gun. And so it is just like a shooting frenzy there. They end up killing 3 of the outlaws, wounding almost everybody except Jesse and Frank James, and they end up riding away without stealing a single dollar. Ames is actually in the midst of it, and one of the things he does is he kind of takes over like a colonel would his own regiment, and he actually directs one of the lethal shots by calming the nerves of a local shopkeeper and directing him where to shoot. That actually leads to killing one of the members of the gang. What's fascinating about this raid, and there's actually a movie about this, I think it was made in the 80s, but the reason it's believed that the Jesse James contingent goes there is because Ames and Butler have money in that bank, and they're those dirty carpetbaggers. And Jesse James and Frank James and the Youngers, they were Confederate soldiers. So the Civil War and Mississippi is still continuing even after the war is over. One of my favorite bits of information about this raid is that, because it's what they did, they took pictures of the dead bodies and sold them, all right? This is a big deal. And they ran out of photographs, and the guy made thousands of dollars selling the pictures of these dead bodies. This is probably the richest photographer in all of Minnesota. So this is one of those interesting stories about Ames where things keep going, but he and Blanche, their life settles down a little bit. In fact, this picture right here is shortly around the time where Ames is going to win his Congressional Medal of Honor. He actually gets it about 3 decades after the war ends. He has 2 sons and 4 daughters. The sons are named Butler, named after the Butler family. And his other son is named Adalbert Jr. In fact, if you look up the name Adelbert Ames, you might find as much information on his son. His son became a famous scientist, as a matter of fact. He has 4 daughters. I believe it's Jessie, Edith, Sarah, and Blanche. In that order are the names of his daughters. And so life seems to be calming down. He and his wife are homeschooling their children. They're making a lot of money off the New York Stock Exchange. They've actually have invested with the Butlers into ranches in New Mexico. There's still the flower business. He's doing pretty well for himself. But he still feels a patriotic calling, and that is why, when he is in his 60s, he volunteers to go fight in Cuba during the Spanish-American War. He's one of a handful of people that go there. He actually takes his young son with him to actually take him to Cuba to go fight. And that's the only picture I've been able to find of Adelbert Ames while he is in fact in Cuba. He is made a brigadier general, and he actually only keeps a journal 2 times in his life. You can see my baseball background 2 times. The first time is when he's traveling Europe. The second is his 12-day journey by boat from America to Cuba. When he gets to Cuba, he finds out that most of the fighting is over, not all, but most, and most of the Americans are dying from yellow fever and malaria and dysentery. And he sends his son right back to America. He's like, my wife is going to be all over me if he gets yellow fever. So he sends his son back. While he's there, he does oversee an entire division. He oversees a couple of engagements. And he's there when the Spanish ultimately surrender Santiago, Cuba. But another example of Ames rubbing shoulders with famous people. He is going to team up with a man by the name of Theodore Roosevelt. And the 2 of them, along with a handful of other officers, are going to send an urgent letter to the War Department. Because even though the war is over, the military is focused on moving prisoners of war out of Cuba before their own soldiers. And Ames and Theodore Roosevelt goes over the head of their commander and says, our men are dying and the war is over. We need to get them home now. To which their commander gets a tongue lashing, and they get those soldiers out of Cuba before they keep on dying. Because that's what's killing most of the soldiers during this war. It's yellow fever, it's malaria. And to Ames's credit, not only does he team up with Theodore Roosevelt to produce this letter, which they publish publicly, by the way. They really go over this guy's head. But Ames stays in camp with his men who are resting in New York until every single one of his men is healthy. And then he leaves the service. So even though his wife is like, come home, in his last act of military service, he says, I will stay here until all of my men have either passed on or they've recovered. And so with that, Ames is in his 60s. He's wealthy, his family's doing well, but his life still gets kind of interesting. He does what everybody does now in the 21st century. He retires to Florida. But he doesn't just retire to Florida. He lives in Ormond Beach, which is a pretty prosperous area. And while he's there, he becomes golfing buddies with John Rockefeller, of all people. So again, rubbing shoulders with rather interesting folks. This is him and John Rockefeller there. This is also a picture of Ames and Blanche soon after he comes out of the military in 1890 after his service during the Spanish-American War. There's an interview that Ames gives when he's 96 years old, and he says that being old is not that bad, but it's harder to eat rock candy now. That's actually what he says. So anyway, I thought that was kind of funny. But Ames is still pretty physically sharp. He's in good shape. He's in his 90s at this point. He is the longest surviving Union general at this point. And the only apparent ailment that he has is sometimes his legs get sore and one of his eyelids start drooping a little bit more than usual. But this is actually a really cool picture I found of his. This is him when he's 98 years old going for his daily stroll. And I think it's actually a kind of poignant picture because in 1932, when he's 97 years old, he passes away, which is surreal because think about everything that's involved in 1932. There's movies, there's the radio, there's airplanes. The telephone has become popular, the radio, and yet he's been able to see all of that during this time. He's made it 97 years. In fact, and this is something I thought was kind of interesting, I think there was a small, when I say small, I mean not microscopic. I think there was a small chance he wanted to go fight in World War I. There was a small chance. His son went to fight, and when I'm reading his letters, I'm like, I think this guy wants to go. He would be in his 70s at that time, though. But I'm like, this guy, I think he wants to go and fight. But ultimately, that's the story of Adelbert Ames. And as much as it's a compelling story, I think this is the reason why it matters. And this is why my book's title is specifically Adelbert Ames, the Civil War and the Creation of Modern America. Is the fact that Ames is not just a peripheral character, he's actually a central character. And what's unique is you can follow his life and it explains the entire arc of the Civil War, and it also explains how America begins to modernize after the war. I'm not here to say he's as influential as someone like Grant or Lee or Davis or Lincoln. He's not. But unlike those people, he is there from the first shots in 61 to the very end of Reconstruction. In fact, if you had someone who didn't know anything about the Civil War, but you read Ames's life, you can see all of the building blocks and paces of this entire era. The politics, the military, the aftermath, the modernization. Ames's life is kind of a microcosm. And it's kind of like a special journey you can take where you can see the entire era through the life of one particular person. So I appreciate you guys. You guys sit much longer than my students. At 50 minutes, they're like, I'm out. We're at 58 minutes right now. But again, I humbly appreciate it. One thing I want to announce before, if there's any questions, is that because this was last minute, I feel like a reliever called out of the bullpen because my boss, Dr. Bennett, was originally slated to speak. John had talked to him, but I didn't have any books to bring. But what I'm going to do, and I will share this when the time comes, I have reached out to my publisher and I've asked them to give a discount, the author's discount for my book, which is a 40% discount. So I'm able to get a 40% discount if I order books for myself, and I'm asking them to extend that to you. So when that opportunity allows itself, I will let you guys know, and then you'll be able to get that discount by referencing that I sent you. All right, so I don't have any books, but that's the next best thing I can do. So 40% ain't bad.
He's going to send it to me and John, and we'll get it.
Absolutely. So I will let you know about that so then that can be disseminated. But other than that, I thank you very much. As I said, Civil War roundtables mean a lot to me. That's where I cut my teeth with Civil War history. So I thank you. Appreciate it.